Today we're going to dive into the absolutely wild story of how one of the world's oldest and most useful crops was turned into a public enemy, and how, against all odds, it's making a comeback.
To really get what's going on here, you have to appreciate just how dramatic this shift was. I mean, for pretty much all of human history, cannabis was, well, it was just a plant, a really useful one. Then, bam! In what's just a tiny blip on the historical timeline, it becomes this symbol of national decay. The difference is just, wow, it's staggering.
So that's the big question, right? How did this happen? And the answer, as we're about to see, has almost nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with power, money, and some very clever propaganda.
Okay, so let's rewind. Let's go way back, long before all the controversy and fear-mongering. Because for thousands of years, cannabis had a completely different, and frankly, pretty respected, reputation all over the world.
For 10,000 years, this plant was just woven into the fabric of civilization. Seriously, people used it to make super strong ropes and sails for their ships, they wore clothes made from it, they ate its seeds, and yeah, they used it as medicine and in spiritual ceremonies. It wasn't weird, it was just normal.
So what on earth changed? Well, in the early 1900s, a few very powerful people with some very powerful business interests decided that this plant had to go. They literally manufactured a monster. And their first weapon was language. See, most people knew the plant as cannabis or hemp, but these guys started pushing the Mexican slang term marijuana. Why? To make it sound foreign, scary, and to tie it directly to the growing fear of Mexican immigrants at the time. It was a calculated move.
And here's the real reason behind it all. You gotta follow the money. This wasn't some random moral crusade. New technologies had just made hemp a serious competitor to some of the biggest industries in America.
It was kind of a perfect storm of self-interest, you know? You had the media giant William Randolph Hearst, who owned tons of timberland for his newspapers, and hemp paper was a threat. You had the chemical company DuPont, which was about to launch nylon and didn't want competition from hemp fiber. And then you had this bureaucrat, Harry Anslinger, who needed a new villain to make his government agency seem important. Cannabis became the bad guy they all needed.
And Harry Anslinger, well, he became the public face of this whole war. This guy wasn't a scientist, not at all. He was a master propagandist, and he used his government platform to launch an all-out fear campaign that was completely detached from science.
Anslinger's playbook was as simple as it was ugly. He tapped right into the racial fears of the time. He fed newspapers these completely wild, made-up stories linking cannabis to Mexican workers and black jazz musicians, claiming it made them violent and drove them to seduce white women. He created a full-blown moral panic out of thin air.
Now, this firestorm of fear wasn't just about selling newspapers. It had a very specific goal: to turn that panic into actual policy. And it worked.
The propaganda paid off big time. This tax act was the first killer blow. It put such a massive tax on cannabis and hemp that it basically made them impossible to grow, wiping out a huge American industry. And get this, they did this to industrial hemp too, which has zero psychoactive effects. You can't get high from it. They knew that, and they killed the industry anyway.
A few decades later, things escalated. In 1970, the government officially classified cannabis as a Schedule I drug. That means they put it in the same category as heroin, saying it had no accepted medical value and was incredibly dangerous. This decision flew in the face of all the evidence and became the legal bedrock of the war on drugs.
And that Schedule I classification? It was like pouring gasoline on a fire. It launched the war on drugs into overdrive. You got the DARE programs in schools, Just Say No, and billions of dollars spent on enforcement with mandatory minimum sentences that just devastated entire communities, particularly communities of color.
But here's the thing about the truth. You can try to bury it, but it usually finds a way out. And even with all this propaganda, the reality of what this plant could do couldn't be silenced forever.
The pushback didn't come from politicians. It came from sick people, patients with AIDS, with cancer, with epilepsy. People who were truly suffering started discovering that cannabis offered them relief when nothing else worked, and they started to get loud about it.
This was the moment everything started to change. 1996, California voters passed Prop 215, the first medical cannabis law in the country. It was a direct challenge to the federal government and to decades of lies. It was the first real crack in the wall of prohibition. And once that crack appeared, the whole thing started to crumble, kicking off this wave of change that's just been picking up speed ever since.
I mean, just look at how fast things moved. We go from that first medical law in '96 to the very first states legalizing it for adult recreational use in 2012. Then the federal government makes hemp legal in 2018, which unleashes the whole CBD craze. And now it feels like we're seeing a new state legalize every few months.
And as people started to see legalization in action and realized the sky wasn't falling, and as things like CBD became totally normal, public opinion did a complete 180. An idea that was on the fringe just 30 years ago now has a huge majority of support from Americans.
But, and this is a big but, even with sleek dispensaries that look like tech stores and all this mainstream acceptance, the story is not over. When you spend a century building a stigma, it doesn't just disappear overnight.
The industry today is still battling the ghosts of its past. Cannabis businesses are mostly locked out of the normal banking system. There's still tons of misinformation floating around. And most importantly, it's still federally illegal, a Schedule I drug, which creates this massive, confusing conflict between state and federal law.
And it's so important to remember where this all came from. The entire war on cannabis was never, ever about public health. It was a very deliberate campaign built on racism and fear, all to protect corporate profits and political careers.
So that leaves us with one last question to think about. We know the whole stigma was built on a foundation of lies. We're seeing it crumble day by day. But what is it really going to take to finally fully erase it and let this ancient plant take its place back in the modern world?